What's up guys, my name's Stu, and today we are looking at my lazy Jellyfish build on the Cnidarian Defender. Yes, of course I made a lazy boat for the 4-point Jellyfish. I mean, what else was I going to do with it after looking at that console? Really the big challenge here was how to make mine different from Augie's, because we both made builds that were focused around the Cnidarian Defense console. With some help from member of the channel Mystic Tree, I landed on the idea of doing a pet build. It's not going to be the most meta setup for the ship, but honestly, the whole thing is already meant to be kind of a weird theme build, so may as well lean into it further. Here it is, the Cnidarian Defender, the prize for this year's summer event. This is a decent ship, but being an event ship, it's nothing terribly special. Their stats are often inferior even to most C-store ships, but the really interesting thing about this ship is its console, Cnidarian Defense, which turns the ship into a giant flying jellyfish that shoots lightning all over the place and heals everything nearby. And that console has proven to be surprisingly effective. Anyway, more on that in a bit, let's get into the build. Now, because this build is largely focused around Cnidarian Defense, your weapons are going to be pretty irrelevant. And that's because activating the console actually disables your weapons, so it doesn't really matter which ones you pick. However, I went with plasma weapons as an excuse to use the Ultimate Plasma set. I wanted to use the Omni Beam because this is one of the few weapons that actually gives a passive stat buff ship-wide, in this case a 1% buff to crit chance. I'm also using the console from this set because I wanted to see if the 2-piece bonus would work with the Cnidarian Defense. Sadly it doesn't, but the console is still worth keeping around for the extra crit chance buff, and also because this build is very pet-focused and the ultimate console does come with that little drone swarmer. The swarmer does next to no damage, but it is still thematically appropriate. For the core setup, this was largely based off of Augie's build, so a protomatter deflector from the fleet colony for the buff to crit chance and crit severity, the Romulan advanced prototype impulse engine from the Romulan reputation, which gives a buff to crit severity. I did think about going with the revolutionary warp core to get a little bit more crit severity, but with how much threat this thing is going to pull, I agree with Augie that the Discovery 2-piece is actually a better option, because of its impressive buff to hull regeneration. The devices are my usual setup for an energy weapon build, but honestly most of these really aren't going to be that useful anyway. The only ones worth pointing out are the Reactive Armor Catalyst for the extra heal, and the Kobayashi Maru Transponder for the random buffs. I could have used the Scorpion Fighter device from the episode The Vault. That would also be thematically appropriate because it does launch 3 Scorpion pets, but those things do so little damage, and I don't actually have any on this character, so that would also require me to actually play the Vault, and I really don't like playing the Vault, so I did not bother. In the consoles, like I said earlier, is the Ultimate Modified Swarm Processor. This is here for the crit chance buff, and because the drone fits the theme of the build. Next is the main event for this build, Cnidarian Defense. Activating this turns you into the Star Jelly form, where your weapons and full impulse will be disabled, your speed will be reduced to next to nothing, but it also creates a 10km AoE, inside of which it will cause massive amounts of electrical damage to enemies, and some impressive heals to any allies. You'll get to see how well this thing actually did once we get to the combat log. Next is one of my favorite consoles in the game, Sentry Mode off the Baul Sentry ship. I was pleasantly surprised to find out that you could use Sentry Mode and Cnidarian Defense at the same time. Activating one will trigger a 10-second cooldown on the other, but that's it. Once that cooldown is over, you're free to activate the other one. Since I'm using Sentry Mode, I did consider using the Baul Anti-Proton Lobi set, but because this is a console, it's not actually affected by the 2-piece from the Lobi set, and since my weapons are disabled while Cnidarian Defense is active, there was no point in equipping it. Now, like I said, this is meant to be a pet-focused build, so a lot of these consoles are here just for the sake of that theme. And that includes this next one, Cardassian Mobile Torpedo Platform, off the Cardassian Intel Flight Deck Carrier. Its passives really aren't going to do much here, but its click ability launches a mobile torpedo platform that fires off torpedoes. It can either fire off normal torpedoes or use Torpedo Spread 3 or Salvo 3. Next is Sensor Suspension Burst off the Jarok Alliance Carrier. This is a pet build, so obviously I'm going to want this console for the sake of buffing my pets. Plus the extra crit chance for myself is also nice. Now, because you're going to be stationary and generating a lot of aggro, I've put a little bit more focus on survivability, which is why Hull Image Refractors is here. While I'm at 100% hull, any incoming heals will be applied as extra temporary hull, which is really nice because Cnidarian Defense is going to be constantly healing me. This also gives a 20% buff to all damage, which will buff the Cnidarian Defense's electrical damage. The click ability can also be useful as a panic button, but I've noticed it will also deactivate Sentry Mode if you click it. Next is Swarmer Matrix. Technically these are summon pets as well, so they still fit the theme. It summons 5 Droid Swarmer pets that will deal physical damage to your enemy targets. Defensive Drone Guardians. This summons in a bunch of defensive drones, which will stay near you and use fire at will against anything that gets nearby. All 3 of these consoles are from the Infinity lockboxes, but because they're not attached to ships, they can actually be found pretty easily on the exchange as well. Next is Render Visible off the Discovery D7 Flight Deck Carrier. Clicking this summons in a Nakjej Battlecruiser. That's the Cleave ship. It'll ram an enemy target and then stick around to fight a little bit more before disappearing again. Next is Reinforcement Squadrons off the Discovery Constitution flight deck carrier, which summons in 4 squadrons of tactical flyers. The DPRM off the Atlas prototype Dreadnought, this one should be pretty obvious by now, and Linked Command Matrix off the Jem'Hadar Vanguard carrier, which summons a Jem'Hadar heavy attack craft to fight alongside you. Specializations are the same, Intel Primary for space flanking, and Temporal Operative for Entropic Rider. The personal space traits are going to be a bit different than my usual setup, but not super different. As you can see, we're starting off with Adaptive Offense, which is a crit chance buff that turns into a crit severity buff and then back. Context is for Kings for the bonus damage buff when I'm not getting shot at, and the damage resistance buff when I am getting shot at, and with this build it's probably going to be more so that second one. Hive Defense, anytime I get hit by an enemy I have a chance to summon in 3 Herc Swarmers, though unfortunately you are not going to see that in the 9th rule demonstration later in the video, because I did not realize that the loadout hadn't loaded correctly when I recorded that. Fortunately, it's not going to make a huge difference stats-wise. Next is Anchored, which gives me a stacking damage buff as long as I remain stationary, which is obviously very useful for this build, and keep in mind that all damage is one of the few things that's actually going to buff the Cnidarian Defense console. Innocuous for the crit severity buff and reduced threat generation, Inspirational Leader for the chance at a stacking buff to all my starship skills, Intel Agent Attaché to reduce the cooldown of my captain's abilities, Duelist Fervor, which is another all damage buff, Terran Targeting Systems for the crit severity buff, Unconventional Systems to lower the cooldown of my universal consoles, and Boimler Effect to lower the cooldown of my Bridge Officer abilities. In the starship traits, first we're using She's a Predator off the legendary Scimitar. This will give me a bonus damage buff to all damage anytime I use Attack Pattern Omega, Dimensional Modulation off the Lexington Dreadnought for another bonus all damage buff, One Big Happy Fleet off the legendary Miranda for its shield disable, Strike from Shadows from the Shran Pilot Escort for the bonus damage and crit chance, Terran Targeting Systems from the Mirror Warship for the crit chance buff, and the Ruin of Our Enemies from the Discovery D7 for the stacking bonus damage buff. In the Space Reputation traits, first we have Advanced Targeting Systems for the crit severity buff, Tyler's Duality for the crit chance buff based on my hull capacity, Precision for more crit chance, Saru's Grace for a stacking damage buff every time I use a control ability, and Landry's Loyalty to cleanse myself of debuffs. In the Bridge Officer stations, the first one is a Lieutenant Commander Universal / Miracle Worker seat, which I have put a Science Officer in, though 2 of the 3 abilities are still Miracle Worker. This way I have abilities to trigger Dimensional Modulation and a couple of my duty officers. In the Ensign seat is Destabilize Warp Core. This will trigger a small radiation damage over time on a single target, and if that target explodes while this effect is still active, it will trigger a secondary explosion that deals kinetic damage to anything within 4 kilometers of that target. And the Lieutenant spot is Tractor Beam Repulsors. Being stationary, a lot of your enemies can end up clustering around you a lot, so you're going to want something to push them away a bit so you're not being pounded to death by their Warp Core breaches. This is also here because it's an Unconventional Systems trigger. And in the last spot on the seat is Deploy Gravitic Induction Platform, which is actually a pull ability in case your enemies start wandering away too much. In the Tactical seat, first is something I haven't used in a very long time, Tactical Team. Normally I don't use this because it has a reputation for interrupting firing cycles. But in Jelly mode, I don't really have to worry about a firing cycle, so I brought it back for its small buffs, and because it can reroute power to your shield facings when they're being fired upon. Scatter Volley is here just for when you're not in Jelly mode, and Attack Pattern Beta for its bonus damage buff, and because it triggers She's a Predator. In the Engineering seat, first is Emergency Power to Engines, again for when you're not in Jelly mode. This is a very large ship, so the speed buff can kinda help. Emit Unstable Warp Bubble and Eject Warp Plasma are both here because they're Unconventional Systems triggers. Same with Jam Sensors and Targeting Sensors over here in this Science seat. Reverse Shield Polarity is here for the sake of survival. You're not going to be able to move with this build, and you're going to be generating a lot of threat thanks to the Jelly mode's heal. So we're basically running this as a mix of a damage, tank, and healer. And lastly, Gravity Well for some control. And again, this is another unconventional trigger. In the Duty Officers, first is 27 of 47 for the crit severity buff, 24 of 47 for the crit chance buff and the buff to my power levels, 29 of 47 for another power level buff and the exotic damage buff, the Emergency Con hologram to lower the cooldown of evasive maneuvers anytime I use emergency power to engines, again this is another one for when I'm outside of Jelly mode, a Fabrication Officer to extend the duration of reverse shield polarity, and 39 of 47 as part of my Bridge Officer cooldowns. So yeah, overall this is a really weird ship, and I've put kind of a stupid build on it. I admit that the focus on pets on this kind of build is actually kind of bonkers. I didn't test this build in ISE largely because it's really not well suited for ISE, so instead I'm going to show you it going through the Patrol 9th rule on Elite. 529k, which is impressive, but honestly probably doesn't mean that much because I really don't have anything to compare it to. So let's just go right to the player analysis. As you can see, Cnidarian Defense did do the bulk of the work on this build, but honestly that's to be expected. This is a console that is basically meant to replace all of your weapons, so it's nice to see that that claim is actually held up pretty well. Chained Anti-Proton Destruction comes in a distant second at 59k, that's from the Sentry Mode console, though 59k from a single console really isn't bad. Unlike Cnidarian Defense, this is not meant to replace all of your weapons, so that's actually pretty nice. The disappointment with this build is the pets. After putting so much focus on the pets, they only did about 18k in total. The Guardian drone's doing the most at 5.7k, and in second place at 2.5k was the Anti-Time Entanglement Singularity, which is an active reputation ability with a 5-minute cooldown. Ugh, yeah, that's disappointing. And it just gets worse the further down you go. So yeah, that is my lazy Jellyfish build for the Cnidarian Defender. Like I said, not the most meta setup. In fact, I'm actually kind of disappointed how little damage most of the pets actually did on this. But it's a fun build with a goofy theme built around it, so I mean, how can you not have fun in it? Anyway, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. If you'd like to further support the channel, hit the join button, or hit that super thanks button, or find the link to the merch store down in the description. Thank you so much for watching, my name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.